The sun has gone down at Hangman's Hill, and the ghost at Misery Corner isn't walking tonight. So, welcome to the Weird Tales radio show, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. And now, here's your host, writer, award-winning journalist, best-selling author, and sometime werewolf hunter, Charles Christian.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Weird Tales radio show with me, Charles Christian. Thank you for tuning in again for more weird tales in weird times. In this week's show, we have an interview with Greg Little about the 19th century psychic Edgar Cayce and the quest for the lost continent of Atlantis. That's coming up later in the show. You'll probably be aware that there's a year 2020 disaster bingo card meme going on around social media. So when you get another piece of weird news hitting the headlines, everyone asks, who had killer hornets, or whatever, on their bingo card? Glossing over the contentious subject of politics, which is basically just a big clown's carnival in the UK, as it is in the US, here are some surprise bingo entries for November 2020. Who had? Scientists have observed that some species of plants are evolving a form of camouflage to protect themselves from being picked by humans. Did you have that on your bingo card? Smart cabbages, that's all we need. What about orcas, otherwise known as killer whales? They are deliberately attacking yachts and small boats. So far, it only appears to be one or two rogue pods off the coast of Spain and Portugal who are taking bites out of boats' rudders. Perhaps the orcas have seen the movie Free Willy. And talking of willies, terrible link there, we have the news that John Lydon, better known as Johnny Rotten in the old punk rock band The Sex Pistols, was recently bitten by a flea on his penis after rescuing some squirrels. Yep. I did say that. People I know in the conservation area say wearing pants is always advisable when working with squirrels, presumably to prevent them biting your nuts. And finally, who had this on their bingo card? That scientists have used human genes to make monkey brains grow bigger. These were presumably scientists who had clearly never seen the Planet of the Apes movies. Spoiler alert, the experiment doesn't end well for the human race. Next up, here's a footnote to our recent shows when we were talking to Dr. Richard Spence about Aleister Crowley. Did you know that one of Crowley's daughters was alive and living in Oakland, California until as recently as November 2014, when she died of natural causes? She was born in Kefaloon on the island of Sicily, where Crowley had set up his Abbey of Thelema, almost 100 years ago to the day on the 26th of November 1920. Her mother was a recently widowed American, Nina Frau Shumway, and the daughter's name was Louise Shumway, although Crowley preferred to call her Astarte Lulu Panthea. Being Crowley, there were inevitably complications because not only was Ninette Crowley's lover, but he also had another mistress, Leah Hersig, living with him on the island. In fact, the two women met while they were both crossing the Atlantic from the US to Europe on the same ship. Anyway, fast forward a few months to Sicily, and Leah Hersig, who already had one child by Crowley, was now pregnant with another. Sadly, the child died and Leah subsequently miscarried. This led Crowley to conclude that Ninette, now in the 8th month of her pregnancy, had worked some kind of witchcraft or spell. So he and the other devotees in the abbey exorcised her and cast her out of the abbey for the duration of her pregnancy. This is the exorcism ritual they used. Ninette Frau, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Initiation purges. There is excreted a stench and a pestilence. In your case, 2 have been killed outright, and the rest made ill. There are signs that the process may lead to purification and things made safe within a short time, but we cannot risk further damage. If the hate is still in course, it had better coil back on its source. Keep your diary going carefully. Go and live in Kefaloon alone. Go to the hospital alone. The day before you come out, send up your diary, and I will reconsider things. I shall hope to see the ulcers healing. Do not answer this. Simply do as I say. Love is the law. Love under will. Anyway, Ninette gave birth to her daughter Louise, who was born a healthy child, and she returned to the United States in 1930, where she was brought up by her mother's older sister, Helena. Despite her bizarre childhood, Louise lived a conventional life. She graduated from the University of California. She became a school teacher. She married. She became Louise Mueller. She had children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and for 50 years was a member of her local Presbyterian church. And she was universally known as Lou, and never as Astarte. By the way, we'll be talking to Richard Spence again in the new year about Sidney Riley, the spy who almost pulled off a coup in Russia that could have toppled the communist government before it had become fully established. Now for this week's interview, and we're talking to Dr. Greg Little about Edgar Cayce, Atlantis, and the theory that the lost continent is somewhere in the Bahamas. Intriguingly, Greg Little has put his money where his mouth is and spent many months and many visits to the Bahamas conducting underwater surveys around the Bimini Road area and within the Bermuda Triangle. What else can I tell you about Greg Little? He has a master's degree in psychology and a doctorate in counseling and educational psychology from Memphis State. He is a nationally certified psychologist specializing in criminal treatment. He is the author or co-author of over 50 books and has been featured on numerous TV documentaries, including shows on the History, Discovery, National Geographic, Sci-Fi, and MSNBC TV channels. Along with his wife Laura, for over 10 years he was involved in the search for Edgar Cayce's Atlantis in the Bahamas. He has also been involved with the Alternative Perceptions magazine for nearly 20 years and the Edgar Cayce Association for Research and Enlightenment. You can find web links to the AP magazine and the Edgar Cayce ARE sites on our website at www.urbanfantasist.com. Now, on with the interview. We've got a number of interesting topics to cover, but we're going to start off with Edgar Cayce and the topic of Atlantis.
Very interesting. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate that. Edgar Cayce. Well, Edgar Cayce is America's greatest psychic of all time. Very well known. There's a very large organization, actually 3 organizations that are still very active and very large in the States. That is the Association for Research and Enlightenment, or the ARE, which is the member organization. There's also the Edgar Cayce Foundation, and they operate Atlantic University. Edgar Cayce is best known for health readings. That is another complete story. But yes, he gave quite a few readings on Atlantis, and ancient history topics popped up quite unexpectedly with the Cayces. To give you a little time frame, Cayce was born in 1877, so it's not long after the American Civil War.
Yeah.
And at that time, medicine was pretty primitive. If you had pretty much any kind of infection, they basically amputated whatever appendage the infection was in.
Yeah.
And there wasn't much medical care. But anyway, born in 1877, and he became very well known in his hometown, which was Hopkinsville, Kentucky, mainly because of his ability to memorize things. And there are a lot of well-documented stories that made the newspapers way back then about him memorizing enormous amounts of material after just looking at pages in a book or hearing someone. The most interesting story I've ever read about was when Cayce was 14, I believe. His father made a $10 bet with a United States House of Representatives member from Kentucky who had just been appointed the ambassador to Peru by our new president. It was in Grover Cleveland. And this House of Representatives guy had just given a 110-page handwritten speech in the U.S. House of Representatives. And he made this bet with Cayce's father after his father bragged that Cayce could memorize anything. Basically, I'll bet he can't memorize this speech word for word, particularly if I don't show it to him and you just read it out loud to him. And so his father made the bet, and what they did is they read the speech out loud to Cayce before he went to bed. They did this 2 nights in a row. He was never allowed to touch the speech. The speech wasn't allowed to stay with his father at night. And then the next morning, in front of over 50 people, including newspaper reporters, the U.S. politician, all the teachers in Cayce's school, and the students, little tiny school, he verbatim gave that speech word for word without a mistake. And it was so impressive that the local newspaper, the Kentucky New Era is what it was called, ran a large article about it. But Cayce got very famous because of that. And then in 1901, he was hypnotized by a stage hypnotist. And this is really where it all started. He had an affliction. He couldn't speak. He'd lost his voice. And under hypnosis, stage hypnosis was then coming in. It was called mesmerism then.
Yeah.
But it was just getting popular. Under hypnosis, Cayce could speak almost perfectly. But as soon as the hypnotic trance was lifted, his voice went back. So several other hypnotists then tried to bring his voice back without success. And then finally, a local osteopath who was also being trained at hypnosis brought Cayce into his office. And under a hypnotic trance, Cayce himself said, "I have the body and the entity here." And he made a suggestion, and it was to the osteopath, tell the body to increase circulation to the throat area. So the osteopath made that hypnotic suggestion to Edgar Cayce, who was asleep and also saying these words, to increase the circulation. There were several people there witnessing it. They said his throat went bright red. He then awakened him from the hypnotic trance. Edgar coughed up some blood and could speak normally. Now that's interesting, but the osteopath had been plagued for decades with a gastrointestinal problem without any success in treating it. So he then decided, well, if Cayce can cure himself, maybe he can cure me. Now that sounds bizarre. It sounds bizarre to me. I'm a psychologist. That sounds very strange, but that was his reasoning. So under hypnosis, Edgar did sort of a scan of the osteopath's body, and a psychic scan, and then recommended a remedy. The remedy worked. The osteopath was delighted, and word started circulating, and then more and more people began seeking out Cayce for these psychic readings, particularly with health. And they were all about health until 1923. Now, in 1923, by then, Cayce had given about 8,000 readings, and they were all about health.
Yeah.
And they were phenomenally successful. But in 1923, Cayce was asked by it was a Dayton, Ohio businessman to come to Dayton, and he wanted readings. Didn't really tell him what they were about. But in those readings, this guy asked, his name was Lammers. Lammers asked him about theosophy, ancient history, philosophy, and a variety of other things. And in those readings, Atlantis popped out, and ancient history, and also reincarnation. That's the main way that Atlantis came out in all this. It was about reincarnation. The Cayce family was a devout fundamentalist Christians. And when the whole idea of reincarnation came out, it just scared the death out of them. They decided, though, that so many people had been helped with the health readings that they would simply continue and do those unless someone was hurt. And no one ever was. So, again, we're back. We're getting to Atlantis now. In another reading, Cayce was taken to Florida by a group of really oil prospectors. And they were asking Cayce if there was oil near the small island of Bimini. It's spelled Bimini. It's 55 miles due east of Fort Lauderdale and Miami in Florida. It's the closest Bahama Islands to the mainland of the United States. So in that reading, Cayce said, no, there's no oil there at all. However, he said, this is the highest portion of a once great land. And then they did another reading, and he called it Poseidia initially, which is another term for Atlantis because the Greek god Poseidon supposedly started Atlantis. So then over a number of years, Cayce gave more and more readings giving a detailed history of Atlantis. And he basically said Atlantis was an island empire. It extended from the Straits of Gibraltar, which would have been the Pillars of Hercules in Greek mythology, across the Atlantic into the Caribbean, and that remnants of the Atlanteans had fled to the Americas, in North America in particular, and they became the Iroquois tribe, really the rulers of the Iroquois. They had gone also to South and Central America and to various other areas of the world. In fact, Stonehenge is mentioned in Cayce readings, and it goes way back in time.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a thumbnail of it. My wife and I began a project in the year 2002. It was because of a British researcher by the name of Andrew Collins. I suspect you know who Andrew is.
Yes, we've had him on this show, yes.
Absolutely. Andrew and I have become colleagues and co-authors of, we're on our second book as we've co-authored now. The first one was called Denisovan Origins.
Yes.
But in any event, we started a project going into the Bahamas and looking for what Cayce called the Hall of Records, looking for a temple that Cayce said could be found in the Bahamas, not too far from Bimini. He gave instructions about how to find it. We believe we probably did find something that we definitely found a temple. We're not really sure. We have been the temple that we found is called Brown's Ruins. Andrew has put it in a rewrite of his book called Atlantis in the Caribbean, which was a rewrite of an earlier book that he did. The Bahamas has declared it an official archaeology site, which essentially shuts out any more research on it until someone comes in and decides to do a great deal of archaeology work on it. But it's very clearly a temple. Yeah. But my wife and I spent 25 weeks searching in the Bahamas using side scan sonar, doing a lot of satellite imagery, and also many, many aerial flights at extremely low altitude. Most of what we found are natural formations. We found 31 crashed planes, including 3 that were clearly Bermuda Triangle planes. It is in the heart of the Bermuda Triangle where we're looking. We had a number of very strange experiences. We took Andrew Collins there with us on one trip, but we spent 26 weeks searching the Bahamas on boats. We also went into the Yucatan to what Cayce called the third Hall of Records. There are 3 of those. We can get into that if you want. But that's kind of a thumbnail of what we did with the Atlantis research.
Right. Now, because one of the things that crops up is the Bimini Road, or is it the Bimini Wall?
Well,
and
both.
There's a lot of debate, isn't there, between whether it's a natural formation or whether it's an artificial formation.
Right. Well, initially, we had no intention of looking at the Bimini Road. I believed everything the geologists said. I've since talked to the geologists, had many interactions with them, and the archaeologists involved. But initially, we had no intention of going there. In fact, we didn't until the fourth week that we were in the Bahamas. We didn't even go to Bimini. We went directly to an island called Andros to find some formations. But on Andros, we found something. Actually, I say we found it. We were led to something that had been hidden, really, I guess, forever. And locals came to trust us and told us about it. And then we realized we have to look at the Bimini Road now. Now, some people call it the Bimini Road, others call it the Bimini Wall, because initially they thought it looked like a big paved road, and others said, no, it looks like a collapsed wall. But we went to the Bimini Road 2 years after we searched Andros Island and found a number of things there. Andros is the largest of the Bahama Islands. It's basically 150 miles further on from Bimini. The Bimini Road is, in fact, made out of what's called beach rock. And it's natural rock, of course. All rock is natural. I mean, the Great Pyramid is made of natural stone.
Yes,
it's just been cut.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure you know a lot about the Phoenicians and the harbors that are in the Mediterranean. There are many of them. They are made out of Mediterranean beach rock. Beach rock is a natural form of stone. It's a carbonate. In the Caribbean, it's limestone carbonate. In the Mediterranean, it becomes what's called sandstone carbonate, and you can carbon date carbonate rock, natural carbonate rock. So the Bimini Road is made of natural beach rock, and the geologist argued for many years that it is natural rock. Well, so what? And there's just one geologist who claimed that he did these cores and they all tilted toward deep water. It's very complicated. And he wouldn't give anybody his research, though, the actual study. Well, we got the actual study, and virtually everything that he has said about it is untrue. I actually found that this geologist, who when he was working for the U.S. Geological Survey, as a geologist working in the Miami field office of the United States Government Geological Survey, he was making fake archaeological artifacts, taking them to the Bahamas and planting them. Now, that sounds absolutely bizarre. It's like, how could anyone say that? And I heard that many, many years ago. I didn't believe it until I watched a film of him giving a talk at the University of, I think it's Sarasota, or it could have been South Florida University. And he was asked during that by a person in the geology department that I was there back in the 70s. And you were making these artifacts and you were taking them over. Did you ever hear anything about it? And he laughed about it and he said, I really hope that one of those Atlantis people would find these and put it in a magazine article or a book or something. He said, but they never popped up. So he's admitted openly to doing it.
Yeah.
Everybody thought it was a big joke. Everybody all the geologists, all the students, there must have been 100 people in the audience. Everybody just thought it was hilarious. But to me, as a scientist, I'm trained in ethics. I'm trained in science. I was trained in experimental psychology. That's something you don't do. You don't make false evidence. But he also lied about all the things that he found there. And when I confronted him, he said that, and I have this in writing from him, he said, I did it all for fun. It was just a lot of fun. If you read his articles, he talks about the 70s and all the people that would come down and sunbathe on the boats nude, and everybody, free love and flowers and all that, how they go down and smoke marijuana. And it was just a lot of fun seeing all that. So we started investigating the Bimini Road and found that it does, in fact, have multiple levels. It's not just laying on the bottom. There are lots. We did this with National Geographic. There are lots and lots of what are called balancing wedge stones, leveling wedge stones that are pounded under the biggest stones at the top. They look like a wedge, like a triangular wedge cut out of a stone that are then pounded under these massive blocks to lift one side or another to level them. So we have also done carbon dating. We found lots of ancient stone anchors in there. The Bimini Road certainly does not go back to the time of Atlantis. And what we have said, and what we have some archaeologists that agree with, is that the Bimini Road is probably 90% an ancient harbor. It is a breakwater. It forms a enclosure, and it probably dates to about 4000 BC. So it would be a maritime culture in the Bahamas that existed long after Atlantis disappeared.
Just jump in there. What date do you think Atlantis, or do you believe Atlantis was? Just so we get our time scales.
Okay, Cayce and Plato, which is where the original story came from, they agreed. Both of them have said that Atlantis, all Plato did was tell us when it ended. I mean, he talked about the beginning, but he gave no date. So Plato said that it ended roughly 9,600 BC or BCE.
Yeah.
Cayce gave a date of 10,000 BC, just a rounded off date of 10,000 BC. Cayce, however, gave a date of when Atlantis began, and he said it began roughly around 205,000 BC is when it began. And he gave real details about it. Cayce didn't talk about Poseidon much, but he did say there was a temple of the Poseidonians and all that they worshipped Poseidon, among other things.
Yeah.
So that's the time frame. Both Cayce and Plato said that Atlantis went under roughly 10,000 BC. Both of them agreed that it was some sort of cataclysm that came from the sky. Plato actually talked about how the earth had civilizations in ancient times that had been destroyed again and again, advanced civilizations, and that it came from the movements of objects in the sky. And Cayce essentially said the same thing. Cayce, however, said the Atlanteans were told about it in advance, around 10,500 BC, and they made a plan to keep the records and the information from Atlantis preserved. And that's where the whole idea of the Hall of Records comes from. And Cayce said there are 3 Hall of Records, and they're identical. Everybody knows about Egypt. That is one of the things everybody thinks, that there is a Hall of Records under the right paw of the Sphinx, right where Edgar Cayce said it was. Zahi Hawass, who is sort of against all this, people don't know this, but Zahi just appeared at the ARE. Zahi has been involved with the Cayce organization for a long time. Mark Lerner lived there for a long time at the Cayce organization. Lots of these people are directly involved with the organization one way or another. Of course, Zahi says publicly all the time, I don't believe in the Hall of Records. I don't believe it's there. I don't think there's anything under the Sphinx. However, research has repeatedly shown there is some sort of a cavity or opening or chamber or something about 30 feet down or so under the rock, under the right paw of the Sphinx. But that so far has not been found.
Yeah.
Now, actually, the Egyptians allowed ARE members to come over there and drill by the Sphinx as early as the 1940s. And very few people, 2 ladies who were in the ARE went over and drilled there. I mean, it's incredible. When you actually know the history of all this, it's just mind-boggling what all has gone on with this. But anyway, that's a summary. 3 Hall of Records. One of them is that temple in the Bahamas, which we believe we may very well have found. And the third one is, we've called it the Lost Hall of Records, but it's been identified at a site called Piedras Negras in Guatemala on the Usumacinta River, not really that far from Palenque.
You're listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian.
Would that therefore be under Mayan-type ruins or what?
Yes. We have been to Piedras Negras. It is not an easy site to get to, and it is not a tourist site. It is very dangerous and very rough and remote, difficult to get there. we actually, if you know, those old expeditions you see people put together where you have one or two people that get a whole bunch of helpers that carry in stuff. My wife and I actually did that, and that was back in 2004. She and I put together an expedition into Piedras Negras. We had to go through Guatemala to get there. While we were there, we saw drug runners go up and down the river. After we left Piedras Negras, the drug cartels actually took over the pyramids there. It's a massive city under the jungle, has many, many pyramid structures and exceedingly high. I mean, they go up the mountainsides, but they actually put gun emplacements in it. And the U.S. DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration, along with the Guatemalan armed forces, went in with gunships and got them out. And that's the last that I've heard about that. But it's a very dangerous place. It was the main line for cocaine to come into the United States. Cocaine would come up from Central America. When they got to the Usumacinta River, it led them to the Caribbean. Then it was flown into the Bahamas, and from there it was brought into South Florida and Texas and elsewhere. Yeah. But that's the main line for cocaine from South America.
Right.
So it's a dangerous place.
Yes. So we've talked about the Bimini Roads or the Bimini Wall, that it is a man-made harbour, but going back about 4,000 years, you say, so 2000 BC. So
well, actually around 3 to 4,000 BC is what
3 to 4,000 BC, yeah.
BC. But that's not the time of Atlantis. Now, I can tell you what's there that does date right to the end of Atlantis. And this, very little has been done with this. We did a documentary with the History Channel. We did several with them called Mystery Quest. And one of them was on the Bermuda Triangle looking at the crashed planes, and another one was on Atlantis. There is about 7 miles off of Bimini toward the United States. The water gets deeper. And right at the 115 foot level, when you're 100 feet below the surface, you see the 10,000 BC shoreline. The 10,000 BC shoreline was right at 100 feet. Now, most people know that in the last ice age, the sea levels were lower. The maximum lowering that they ever saw was about 330 feet or so, maybe 350 feet. And all those ancient sea levels and the ancient beaches have been identified by archaeologists at Florida State University who work, underwater archaeologists that work in that area. So if you dive to 110 feet, you can actually see the 10,000 BC shoreline. Right. So right above that shoreline, and this was initially discovered with a side scan sonar project the ARE sponsored that an archaeologist out of California performed for them. Right there, there's a long line that goes about 1.5 miles long following that shoreline. And if you look down on that line, what you see is a square and rectangular thing, and then you see white sand. Then you see another square and rectangular, looks like a structure. And then you see more white sand, then another one, then another one, then another one. And then if you go a little further toward the land, which it then gets to about 90 feet in depth, you see another long line of these square and rectangular structures. These lines are about 1 mile long, 1.5 miles long. And then you see a third. There are 3 lines of these square and rectangular structures. We've actually counted them in side scan sonar, and the best we've come up with is about 70 to 74 of them. So they're right at the maximum depth that recreational divers can go. We also had people with the History Channel that used mixed gases so they could stay down longer. And all these look like stone building structures. They look like the foundations of stone structures with blocks. It's all covered in coral. And then it looks like the roofs collapsed and then it filled in with sand over thousands of years. The water moves pretty swiftly down there. There are deep water currents that go on. And it really hasn't been evaluated any more than what I've just told you. We have photographs of it that look like blocks. They are very square and very rectangular. And it looks like what would have been right along the 10,000 BC shoreline. So they look like cargo structures, places where you'd move cargo back and forth to the shoreline.
Mm-hmm.
So that is another thing that's been found there. And that and the temple structure that we found called Brown's Ruins, which is an enormous 500 and some foot long teardrop shaped formation on the bottom. There are stone columns, fluted columns. There are these massive stone beams, flat stone. We've had it geologically tested by 3 universities. It is made out of green schist, schist, and it's identical to the stone that the Oracle of Delphi in Greece was made from. So that's just a summary of some of the things that we found. We found a lot more, but that's pretty much the most interesting stuff that we ever found there.
Yeah. Now, it's fascinating that the temple, the Bimini Walls side, 4,000 BC, is that thought to have been maybe contemporaries of the Phoenicians, or, a Mediterranean-based culture, or one in the Americas?
Well, it's not no maritime cultures on the Atlantic side and the Caribbean are recognized before roughly the year 1000, which is insane.
Yeah.
They claim the Bahamas were not even occupied until 500 BC at the very earliest, and that's insane too. And part of that is they say, well, we can't find any evidence for it. If you've ever been in the Bahamas, if you've ever been on those islands during a storm, well, I'll give a good example. We used to stay on South Bimini at a 2-story motel, which was right by a marina where we kept boats, our boat and others, because we got our own boat to use there. The 3rd year we were there, a hurricane came through, and a wall of water about 40 foot tall went across that part of the island, and it swept that entire hotel right into the ocean. Just bam, just swept the whole thing. Yeah. So if you go there and look now, what you see is just a lot of sand and some rock. That's it. You don't even see the rock of the hotel. It all went in the ocean. And so these hurricanes, the highest land in Bimini above sea level is about 12 feet. Most of it's 8 feet above sea level at high tide. That's it.
That's not very high at all. No.
No, I mean, these islands are constantly swept over by tidal. Well, I would call them a tidal wave, but it's the tidal surge coming from hurricanes, and they're hit all the time. So it just literally wipes everything off. It keeps sweeping it clean. So yeah, the Bahamas, not a lot has been found in the Bahamas of people living there before 500 BC. In fact, nothing. The only thing you find is stone, which is hard to date.
Yeah.
You only know when the stone formed. You don't know when it was carved and used. So no, mainstream archaeology doesn't recognize any of that. Mainstream archaeology would never admit the Phoenicians came over there. We did find loads and loads of stone anchors, again with National Geographic, and they actually had those carbon dated too. They look identical to Phoenician stone anchors, exactly the same. They had never been reported there before, but we really searched areas thoroughly with side scan sonar. So we found many, many things no one had ever found before. And we pretty much got scanning everywhere around Bimini, and then enormous areas between Bimini and Andros. But we've barely searched what's available to search there.
Yeah.
So no, mainstream archaeology doesn't recognize any of this. I will say we have friends that are very well-known mainstream archaeologists. They completely agree with us that there was some sort of a maritime culture there, but they can't mention their names.
Yeah.
We're not allowed to mention their names. We're not allowed to talk about who they are because they will lose their jobs. They won't get academic promotions, and they won't get funding on grants. It's really they literally said that to us.
Yeah.
That we'll lose everything.
Yeah.
Their credibility is gone. And it's because mainstream archaeology is written in textbooks and articles that Atlantis never existed. It's all a hoax, that everything in the Bahamas is natural.
Good day, gentlefolk. I doth have breaking news. Your Weird Tales host, Charles Christian, has written a new book called Saints and Sinners in Dark Age England. 5 shocking true tales that are stranger than fiction. There's murder, mayhem, treason, incest, adultery, and worse. Read about the real antics of 9 saints. Yes, saints. 8 kings and 5 queens of England, plus the wickedest of all stepmothers. And be amazed, or horrified, or appalled, or all 3. If you love weird history, and methinks you do, hop over to Amazon for your copy of Charles Christian's Saints and Sinners in Dark Age England. Grab yours now. England, home to zombies, werewolves, green-skinned fairy folk? And how about dragons, strange monoliths and vampires? If you're fascinated by the bizarre and unexplained, join Charles on a road trip around the newly discovered walled Bermuda Triangle, where fact is much weirder than any fiction. Check out Charles Christian's fantastic Kindle book, A Travel Guide to Yorkshire's Weird Wolds, on amazon.co.uk and amazon.com.
The closest we got to it when we found this temple thing, some people got very, very excited about it, and the Bahamas, so that we couldn't do any more archaeological work on it, they officially declared it an archaeological site. And this is bizarre, but the Microsoft Corporation put a salvage claim on this spot, on the temple site. So we can't go do any work there at all. The only thing we can do is go under a film permit and refilm it, although we've filmed the whole thing anyway. We've got tons of film of it. Yeah. And the representative of Microsoft, they have a large archaeological foundation. They were talking initially about trying to reconstruct this thing because it's very clearly the remains of a temple, and it looks like it was standing on a high point, which is now roughly 20 feet underwater, and a huge wave came over and knocked it down. That's what it looks like. Yeah, that's exactly what it looks like.
Which, of course, ties in with all the suggestions about the end of Atlantis as well.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. It was swept away, as opposed to destroyed by a volcano or something in the historical.
Well, if you actually read, Andrew Collins is the first person I ever saw who suggested that the main island of Atlantis was on Cuba. There is a place, if you get on Google Earth and you look at the Zapata Peninsula, Z-A-P-A-T-A, Zapata Peninsula, you will see a round, it's in the south end of Cuba, the center, southern part, but it's in the center of the island, south of Havana on the other side of Cuba. You will see that there is a mountain range just to the north of it, and you will see canals coming down from the mountain range. There's a load of canals in there, all of which lead to this area of Zapata. And it is round. It is the exact circular size that Plato described the center city. And then it leads out into the ocean from there, and it's the exact length into the ocean that Plato described. It is the center island, which I'm calling it an island. You can actually see it's not very deep from Google Earth. And we got soundings made by the British back in the 1800s from there. And it all matches. It looks like there are concentric rings that are coming up from the bottom, and it's much higher in the center. And we have been trying to go there for years. And we were hopeful at one time that we could get in. But Zapata is near where the Bay of Pigs is. Mm-hmm. And Zapata is off limits for everything. Yeah. This little area is off limits. We're not really sure what's there. Yeah. But anyway, we've been trying to get in there for a couple decades now, and that is the one place I'd really like to go. But I got to credit Andrew with that, and I've pretty much agreed. I think that was part of the island empire of Atlantis. That was the main island. Plato said, that the main island was, I believe it was almost 400 miles long and 150 miles wide or so, but 340 miles or so. But Cuba fits it really well. And Cuban archaeology just doesn't exist. It died in the 1940s. Just went away. So nothing has been done there. And there's great areas of Cuba that no one has explored.
Yes, indeed. What's your next steps with regarding to the Atlantis project, other than obviously trying to get into places like Cuba?
Yeah, well, Cuba's the main thing. We have been trying to get some mainstream archaeologists that have credibility to go and look at this triple line of structures that are at the 10,000 BC level in the Bahamas. But that is it. We spent so much time on boats and found so much. What we really turned our attention to then was investigating all the planes to try and ID all of the planes that we found. And we did ID several. 3 of them were Bermuda Triangle disappearances, including a very famous one. The Royal Air Force actually identified one from the parts that we sent them. And there's a great documentary on the National Geographic. We had a British film crew with us, and we took parts off of a DC-3, a commercial airliner, and they took them over to the Royal Air Force that actually crawled into Royal Air Force aircraft and found the exact place the part went and got the ID, and it was a Bermuda Triangle plane. So they did a fabulous job. So we're still trying to identify a few of the planes, which is not as easy as it seems. Because these are all old and everything was written down then, and all these old there wasn't anything computerized with plane parts, and they swapped them out and nobody knew what they were. They didn't keep numbers. So that is it. We have no intention of getting re-involved in the Atlantis thing, except back to Guatemala, perhaps, to that Hall of Records. We do have a very good contact, a Guatemalan archaeologist, and we still have an intention of looking at these 50 to 70 square and rectangular formations off of Bimini. But we are simply, I'm so enmeshed in doing a project with Andrew Collins now, our follow-up book to the last one. And my wife is actually chairperson of the board of trustees of the Edgar Cayce Foundation, the ARE, the membership organization, and Atlantic University. So she is constantly involved in that business, the Cayce organization. So we're still pretty involved in all that.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned Andrew Collins and that you worked with him on his book about the Denisovans. Is that one of your projects you're working on with him now?
Well, it's a follow-up book on it, and we've actually completed it. We are just in the stages. I am totally done, and he is totally done, except he is still getting the little details you have to get for permissions on illustrations, and so on. And we're about to send that into the publisher. Same publisher, Inner Traditions, and Barron Company. It is a follow-up to Denisovan Origins, but it has a different scope. It goes way back in time, and it has a lot of Native American stuff in it. And Andrew did some really incredible things, and I'd rather let him talk about it. But all this stuff, Andrew is pushing back to 700,000 BC. Investigating sites with humans, not in Africa, I guess you could say it's Africa. No, not really, that go back to 700,000 BC. So that's kind of where it starts.
Yes. Because, the whole thing with the Denisovans and I can never remember the correct pronunciation, the place in Turkey.
Göbekli Tepe. Yeah.
Is that it is pushing back the time scale for human or human-like civilizations building large constructions, because the normal model you have is it really doesn't really kick off until the Mesopotamians are building their mud ziggurats and the Egyptians are building their pyramids, and everybody else is living in huts.
Here's the weird thing. In America, most people don't know this, and the oldest mounds in the Americas are in South America, and they go back to 10,400 years ago, and they still haven't dated some that are probably older. 10,400 years ago, way before Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, things, and what Andrew has just done, he's pushing it back to 700,000 years ago. We're not talking about primitive people here. We're talking about unknowns that keep popping up. So things are much older than anybody ever thought.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting stuff. So, when he found out this stuff, Andrew immediately jumped on a plane, even in the midst of COVID, and did what he had to do to follow up on it. I have really focused on North America and South America. I am best known for other than Atlantis, best known for my work with Native Americans and Native American mounds.
I was going to ask you about that because you've written illustrated encyclopedia of them.
Yeah, I've actually written a lot about it, and that's my most interesting stuff. And maybe we can do that in another show sometime.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of stuff, a lot of information there, and their American mounds are virtually identical to the ones that I've seen in Sweden. We've been all over Sweden and seen them, and in the UK, seen loads and loads in the UK, and there are the same kind of stone chambers over here. And most people don't know this. Inside of North American mounds, in the burial mounds in particular, there are stone chambers that look just like the ones in England. But people don't know that.
No, we don't.
It's just amazing.
Most people outside of, well, I don't know how many Americans know about it, but I mean, most people outside don't know anything about the Native American cultures. Yeah. We know about the Aztecs and the Incas and so on. Yeah. But the Indian mounds and earthworks, it's very much, well, they were just sort of nomads who lived in teepees.
And they weren't.
And that was it.
They weren't. Yeah, but that's not true. And they actually chose to live that way. The North American Indians were different from those in Central and South America. They had very different philosophies, and there's reasons for that. It has to do with what they believe humans are here for. We can talk hours about that, and all that's in this new book. And it's stuff that very few people have ever heard before, the deepest beliefs. And we've only known the deepest beliefs of Native Americans. When I say Native Americans, I predominantly mean Native North Americans.
Yeah.
Because those in South and Central America are also Native Americans. They're indigenous people, but they're not the same. So they had a different philosophy, and people ask me, why didn't they invent the wheel? And the answer is they didn't need the wheel. They didn't believe in land ownership. They didn't believe in having many possessions. The whole idea of land ownership was absurd. You shared resources. You simply shared the land with the animals and the spiritual world around you. And when you got what you needed from the land, you moved on and you shared it, and then you just kept moving on. They were somewhat nomadic, but it had to do with their philosophy. And they were here. They had a difference in belief. They believed we were here to have balance and harmony with nature, to maintain it. That was our obligation. And if you killed things without reason, if you used all the resources that you didn't need, if you stockpiled things that you didn't need, like we stockpile. We stockpile. We get houses bigger than we need. We get cars bigger than we need. We get all kinds of things. We accumulate objects that we never will use again.
Yes.
And we accumulate money for the future. And we buy land, which we don't really own anyway because of taxes. But they didn't believe in any of that because all those things are disharmonious. They lead us out of balance.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I say, maybe in another show we can...
I think we'd definitely like to follow that up with another show on that, because as you say, it's a huge topic, and we're pretty much running out of time now. And rather than try and cover such an epic topic in a couple of minutes, I think we'll leave that for another day. So I have to say, it's been a fascinating
thank you.
Discussion we've had here. Thank you very much for your time.
I appreciate it, and I love your accent. Of course, to me, it's an accent. To you, I probably sound like I'm some hick from the South, which I live in Memphis, Tennessee, which is pretty darn South, but I'm not originally from there.
Right.
So I sound like an American, don't I?
Well, you do, yes. And I do appreciate as well that Americans actually have different accents we're talking about the United States, that actually have different accents depending on which part of the states they come from. But
absolutely.
We tend to put them all together as that's an American accent. Which
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much. And maybe sometime soon we'll do it again.
Once again, big thank you to our guest, Dr. Gregory Little, and we'll also be talking to Greg next year about another ancient mysteries topic, namely North American Indian mounds and earthworks. And that's it. We're almost out of time. I say almost because there's just one more thing. We are always looking to improve the experience for listeners to this show, and one thing we've been investigating is a facility to provide a written transcript of each shows, which would be available on the website. But it's not to be, because we ran an experiment with last week's show and it didn't go well. The show, you may recall, featured a news item about a haunted house in Ireland called Loftus Hall. That's Loftus, Loftus, Hall. Sadly, the transcription software rendered this on each time the word came up as loft asshole. Back to the drawing board. Now it just remains for me to say this is Charles Christian saying thank you for listening in. Please join me again next week. Until then, stay well, stay weird. Goodbye.
Black Shuck, the demon dog of East Anglia, is baying at the moon, which means it's time for us to go. You've been listening to the Weird Tales radio show with Charles Christian, your weekly fix of ghost stories, urban myths, witchcraft, magic and folklore. You can keep in touch with us online at www.weirdtalesradio.com, by email to weirdtales@icloud.com, and on Twitter @ChristianUncut. Join us again next week for another edition of the Weird Tales radio show. Good night.